So hi everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us this evening. My name's Amy and I'm the museum coordinator at the North Lanark Regional Museum. We are happy to present a digital speaker series, and while this event has no ticket cost, we do encourage you to make a donation to the North Lanark Historical Society. We're a not-for-profit organization that is dedicated to the collection, preservation, and presentation of local history, and your donations help to ensure that we can continue to offer these events. The link to our donation page will be put into the chat box of this meeting. We now ask that you mute your microphones to limit any background noise, but you're welcome to leave your cameras on if you would like. This presentation will be recorded and the video will be used for promotional and educational purposes by the Historical Society and will be posted on our public YouTube page. At the end of the presentation, you're welcome to unmute your microphones and ask any questions to our speaker, or you can type your questions into the chat box. I'm very happy to now introduce our speaker for this evening, Brian Tackaberry. As a descendant of United Empire Loyalists, Brian served as president of the Bay of Quinte Branch of the United Empire Loyalists Association of Canada from 2003 to 2013, and as newsletter editor since 1991. He's a member of the Association of Professional Genealogists, the New England Historic Genealogical Society, the United Empire Loyalist Association of Canada, and the Ontario Genealogical Society. He's published several books and has conducted workshops on genealogy with particular focus on Loyalists. He has documented evidence and obtained certificates for 16 of his United Empire Loyalist ancestors. So please join me in welcoming Brian and thanking him for presenting with us today.
Thanks very much, Amy. And my talk tonight is focusing on the Loyalist settlement along the Rideau, which is one of the few areas that's not as well known as most of the other Loyalist settlements in Canada. So bear with me, I have to put my reading glasses on these days. The American Revolution not only affected the United States, but had a major impact on the creation of much of Canada with the formation of new settlements both in the Maritimes and what was later to become the province of Ontario. Many originally thought of the American Revolution as a fight between the Americans and the British, but it is now estimated that this was the first American Civil War, where you had families with brothers against brothers, fathers against sons, etc. It's now estimated that roughly 1/3 of the population supported the Crown, 1/3 supported independence, and another third just wanted to be indifferent and carry on with their lives. Very similar to George Bush's statements during the first Iraq War, which was you're either with us or you're against us, the Patriots set up what they called committees of public safety, which were not so much safety for loyalists, but safety for the others. And in fact, they confiscated a loyalist property and did some of the harassment and seizure of situations. Now, here you see what was known as tarring and feathering. The tar that they put on a person actually was almost to the point of boiling temperature, followed by the feathers. And the process of removing that was terrible. And quite often the people that had been tarred and feathered ended up getting infections and dying. You may all notice that they're pouring hot tea down because they assumed if you were a loyalist, you were supporting the tea tax, which had inspired the Boston Tea Party. These actions prompted many people who were pacifists to take sides to join the loyalist forces because of the atrocities. Sometimes farms adjacent to each other would be burned and seized, where one farm supported the loyalist cause, once were independence. And this was particularly a regular event in the states of New York and Pennsylvania, as well as in the southern states later on. As more and more conflicts took place, loyalists started forming various loyalist regiments to support the British Army in their cause. And these include groups such as the King's Royal Regiment of New York, John Graves Simcoe's Queen's Rangers, Butlers Rangers, Rogers King's Rangers, and Jessup's Corps. And many of these disbanded soldiers actually ended up in Eastern Ontario following the American Revolution. The largest of the brigades was the King's Royal Regiment of New York, often referred to as simply the Yorkers. They were formed in central New York State along both the Hudson and Mohawk River valleys under the direction of Sir John Johnson, who was a member of the Indian Department with the British. And Sir John Johnson was deeply allied with the Mohawks, and the Mohawks were being led at that time by Joseph Brant, who many of you recall also supported the British cause. Following the defeat of General Cornwallis at the Battle of Yorkton, the surviving armies and loyalist forces retreated to New York City, that was considered a neutral safe haven. Already many other loyalist families that had lost all their possessions had moved to New York, pending the outcome of the war. The man that you see on the left is Sir Guy Carleton, again, a famous name in the Ottawa area. And Carleton had originally been the governor of Quebec during the early part of the Revolution, but was sent to New York City to seek the evacuation of all the British and Loyalist forces. Beginning in September of 1783, the Loyalists and other surviving British armies that are located in New York City started leaving, and by November, they were gone. The ships carried disbanded troops back to England, and the Loyalists were prepared to be sent to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Quebec, all of which were considered to be separate British colonies at that time. For those that went to Quebec, many of them were settled between the city of Montreal and Quebec City at Sorel, which is on the junction of the St. Lawrence River with the Richelieu River. And there they were provided by the British with tents, clothing, and food rations in order to get them through the winter months of 1783. Literally thousands of people came to Canada, and it was, in fact, the first multicultural settlement of Canada, because not only did they consist of English, Scots, and Irish, but people who were German, Dutch, French, Black, Native, and even Jewish populations. As I stated earlier, they did travel to Quebec, and this is where they ended up awaiting dispersal for further properties upstream. In the spring of 1784, the government supplied bateau boats to take the families up the St. Lawrence River. These were flat-bottom boats that could traverse some of the rapids through the St. Lawrence, and the participants also had to sometimes get out and carry on with the portages. It was not an easy trip. They had to endure the harshness of the wilderness areas, as there was no settlements really too much to the west of Montreal, and they were going to a completely unknown area. The Loyalist settlements created a new region of Western Quebec that was later to be known as Upper Canada, and which would become the province of Ontario. Here we can see a bit of a map, and I will see if does the pointer show up okay with this? So here's Montreal, and they traveled up the river here, and several townships had been already set out by surveyors. There was a group of townships that went from present-day Cornwall down to Brockville, and they were called the Royal Townships, and they were named Williamsburg, Charlottenburg, Edwardsburg, Augusta, Elizabethtown, and Matilda, all of which were named for children of King George III. Farther to the west, starting at Kingston and moving to what is now Belleville, were what was called the Cataraqui Townships, and again, a series of townships there were named for the children. And they were called Ernesttown, Fredericksburg, Adolphustown, Marysburg, and Sophiasburg, and Ameliasburg, all again different children. George III was very prolific in his family, not unlike Queen Victoria, that would happen a couple of generations later. Some other Loyalist settlements had occurred in the Niagara River area and around Detroit, and a small one, first of all, on the Ottawa River from Montreal heading up to almost what is now Hawkesbury, and eventually another settlement here along the Rideau River. The first landing of the Loyalists took place officially on June 16th in 1784 in Adolphustown, which is located not too far from Glenora Ferry, about 30 to 40 minutes west of Kingston. And from there, they filled up the townships going to the east. What you see here is a typical settlement where, again, they're provided with canvas tents before they were able to go to their land to be cleared. And this is taken from the Royal Townships, an early original painting. Once the settlers arrived, they set up their own small communities and would then go out to get their various lands. Families were provided tents like this, and believe it or not, some of these tents, the small pup tents that we would assume today would sleep 2 or 3 people, were given to have a family of up to 5 or 6. And they placed them, instead of from the entrance of the tent towards the back, they actually placed them across the tent. So the person furthest in would have to be in lying perpendicular to the door opening. If you had to be the one that got up in the middle of the night, you'd have to crawl over everyone else to have to go out. According to royal decree, Loyalists were allotted land as follows. If you were a single man, you were given 50 acres. If you were a private, 100 acres, a sergeant, 200 acres, a subaltern officer, 500 acres, a captain, 700, 1,000 to an officer above captain, and for every additional family member, it was 50 acres. So if you had a Loyalist ancestor, you may find that he gets several land grants during his lifespan. As his family grew, he could apply for additional land, especially when he married. Once the land was surveyed, they literally drew the names out of a hat in order to determine what lot and concession they would receive. And many of the families actually would exchange their lots with a neighbor in order to move closer to another family friend or a person that they had served with. So if you come across some of the original maps, you'll see one name listed, another name crossed out and replacing that. In this time of the Loyalists, not only did they receive land, but on reaching the age of 21, each one of their sons was to receive an additional 200 acres, and being very progressive for the times, the daughters were also granted 200 acres of land on reaching the age of 21 or in marrying. If you were a settler moving to this area following the settlement by the Loyalists, you would probably seek yourself out a Loyalist daughter to marry, because on your marriage, she would automatically get 200 acres of land. Now I'd like to start speaking more specifically about the Rideau River Valley and some of the settlements that took place there. This is an area that a lot of Loyalist research has not really taken place on over the years. As I mentioned earlier, there was some settlement along the Ottawa River from Montreal up until about Hawkesbury, and they decided that they should look to see if there was anything further that could be done in the area. In the summer of 1783, Lieutenant Gershom French was asked to come and do a survey of the Rideau. Now, this is a picture of a surveying party. Unfortunately, this is taken in winter, designed to be a winter one, but it would have been typical of what they were doing, going through completely forested area with nothing. He organized his party in Montreal and embarked on his journey in birch bark canoes, along with 7 men that belonged to the Provincial Corps of the British Army, and 2 Canadians that would have been French Canadians, and an Indian who served as the guide. Lieutenant French wasn't really looking for a waterway for navigation, but in order to see if the land itself would be suitable for settlement by the Loyalists. Why not Ottawa? Well, he decided that the region of present-day Ottawa was not well suited to be a settlement. First of all, as you can see here, we have the large waterfalls that are depicted in original painting that would be on the Ottawa River now towards the area of the old City Hall, where the Ottawa meets with the Rideau River. In addition, there are various rapids in this area and what was known as a huge malarial swamp around the area of present-day Dow's Lake. These malarial swamps actually did have mosquitoes and would infect people with fever, swamp fever, as they call it. So he decided that this was not a suitable region. The swamps around Dow's Lake were not be drained until Colonel By started doing the construction of the Rideau Canal many years later. One of the worst obstacles, of course, in the city of Ottawa was the present-day HOG'S Falls, which again look like this even today, and are a formidable area that had to be bypassed by the canal. Originally, without the canal system, you would have had to portage, taking all your equipment across a few kilometers of land, and it was very difficult terrain. One of the very first land grants that took place along the Rideau was in what is the present day Smiths Falls. Smiths Falls became the first grant given in 1786 to Major Thomas Smith. However, he spelled his name with a Y. He was a Loyalist, and is the son of Dr. George Smith, who served as a spy for the British during the American Revolution in the area between New York State and Vermont. Major Smith actually did nothing with his land, and he never visited it. And by 1810, he'd mortgaged it to a man who lived in Boston. However, the man from Boston never made any payments, and he assumed he still owned the land. So Smith, in 1823, even though he had had over 35 years, had actually gone back and built a small dam and sawmill on the falls. In 1824, the ownership of the land was contested in court in the town of York, now Toronto, and Smith lost his case. The land was sold at a sheriff's sale in Brockville in 1825 to a fellow by the name of Charles Jones, who also owned land near the present day of Jones Falls. And if any of you have been there, there's a Jones Falls lock station on the land where Jones originally settled. Charles Jones turned around and sold it at a profit to Abel Russell Ward. So it was Ward in 1826 that became the actual first person to start a community in what is now known as Smiths Falls, named for Loyalist Thomas Smith. Shortly after the outbreak of the American Revolution, a man named Roger Stevens, who was a large landowner in Pittsford, aroused the wrath of local rebels by refusing to renounce his allegiance to the British. This act of defiance led to his arrest and imprisonment and the total confiscation of all his properties. He managed to escape and became a guide for the brigade of German troops serving under Major John Burgoyne. He was also imprisoned after Burgoyne's surrender at the Battle of Saratoga in October of 1777, but a second time he was able to engineer an escape with the assistance of his brother Abel, who was a farmer again from Pittsford area and well known as a skillful hunter and fighter against the natives. In 1781, Roger was assigned a position as a spy for the British stationed in the Vermont area, and his brother Abel frequently assisted him in the collection of military and political intelligence to pass on to both the Loyalist and British troops. From 1782 until the end of the war, Abel described Roger as being a loyal man, entirely unsuspected among his fellow rebels, and he was able to travel widely across New York State and New England, gathering information which was relayed to his brother at the secret rendezvous points. Unfortunately, Roger was satisfied with Abel's work, but the British were not as impressed with his brother Abel. One officer actually complained that Abel's reports were not near enough adequate for their expectations or the expenses that were paid for both of them in the monies and furs, etc. of the times. He also claimed that Abel couldn't keep a secret and practiced the art of pretending to many important secrets when he actually had nothing to pass on to the British. Following the American Revolution, Roger Stevens lived for some time in Montreal, and for a few years, he decided to settle on the Rideau River. Roger built a cabin and cleared land on Lot 1 of Montague Township and the adjoining Lot 30 of Marlborough Township on the north shore of the Rideau River. Stevens then constructed the very first sawmill in the area, and it was known as Great Falls, and it would later become Merrickville. Unfortunately, he drowned in 1793 during a hunting trip, despite being known as an excellent swimmer. He's considered to be the first official settler of Carleton County, and today Roger Stevens Drive, that begins near the town of North Gower, is named for him. The area of South Gower, not too far from here, was first settled in 1797 by the Loyalist Grant families. Ensign James Grant had been born in Inverness, Scotland in 1744 and settled in New York State. He served in Major McAlpine's company and with the Burgoyne campaign in New York State. He had recruited men, suffered loss of his property, and had been imprisoned for some time as well. His brother, Peter McAlpine Grant, also born in Inverness in 1761, arrived at South Gower and was the person who constructed the very first sawmill at that location in 1797. Stephen Burritt served in the King's Rangers, and he was born in Arlington, Vermont around 1759. Following the Battle of Bennington in Vermont in 1777, he and his son were captured and imprisoned. But being Masons, were able to give a Masonic sign to the guard and the jailer at the time, and the fellow Mason was able to secretly unlock it and allow his escape. Burritt went on to do more service for the British, and following the end of the Revolution, decided to settle in what was to become Burritt's Rapids. He arrived in 1793, along with his other brothers, Edmund and Daniel, who again, in their own right, were Loyalists. Burritt was married to Martha Stevens, the daughter of Roger Stevens, who was the first Loyalist in the area. Following the American Revolution, during the War of 1812, Burritt, because of his military background, was appointed as colonel in the War of 1812, and the Burritts became a very prosperous family in this new settlement. If you've been through the village, you might know this little white church, which is and the entire Burritt family, who were all Loyalists, and many of the others who are allied with their family, are buried in this picturesque cemetery. You'll notice that there's a historic site marker in the front of the church that marks Stephen Burritt and the settlement of the Loyalists in that area. On the south side of the Rideau River, from Burritt's Rapids, was an area that was known as Nicholson's Rapids. This was settled by another Loyalist, Robert Nicholson, who was a veteran of Jessup's Corps. When the canal was constructed, where you see in this image, the canal being to this area, I can just move my cursor here, just hold on a second. Here are the end of the rapids and the falls, with the canal being built here later on. When the canal was constructed, locks were established at each end of the rapids and a canal to bypass them, and this is still known today as the Nicholson Locks. This is in Montague Township, and it in itself became a small community of Loyalists. One of the other families that settled very close to Nicholson was Daniel Nettleton. He was a Loyalist soldier, again from Jessup's Corps, and he was originally from New London, Connecticut, and married Phoebe Stannard. Daniel died in Montague Township on the Rideau Canal in 1806. The daughter of Daniel and Phoebe Nettleton was called Elizabeth Nettleton. She was born in Albany about 1769, and she married another Loyalist who was called Joseph Knapp. He had emigrated from England to Albany County prior to the outbreak and came to Canada at the close of the American Revolution. He served as a sergeant in the Loyal Rangers. His travels to Canada show the hardships that some of the Loyalist refugees faced. There was an original document that was written on the part of William Scott, who was another Loyalist who came to Eastern Ontario, and I'll quote this. William Scott experienced many trials and privations in his travels to get to Canada. His party consisted of himself, two brothers, and Joseph Knapp. They were all lost in the woods and running out of provisions, so they were compelled to kill their dogs, which were eaten. Becoming so weak that they were unable to walk, they crawled for 3 days on their hands and knees. Knapp became completely exhausted and laid down to die, but his companions kept him going on and finally reached the settlement of Augusta. Men were sent to rescue Knapp, and they were compelled to tie a blanket onto 2 poles in order to carry him to safety from the woods. Despite all of these problems, Knapp set up a new settlement in Montague along this area near Nicholson's Falls, and he achieved the age of 93 years of age. In his obituary, it was noted that he raised 15 children, all of whom were living, 67 grandchildren, 63 great-grandchildren, and 2 great-great-grandchildren, all of whom were living at the time of Joseph Knapp's death. He belonged to the Methodist Church and religiously attended service for over 50 years. Today, not far from Nicholson's Lock, there's a small road called Knapp's Lane that commemorates this brave loyalist. This is a little bit of a questionable area, and I'll tread a little lightly on this. William Merrick was born in Massachusetts in 1760, and he settled the Rideau area as well. In 1793, he acquired from Roger Stevens the sawmill that Stevens had built on the Rideau River, and following the mysterious death of Stevens by drowning while hunting on the river with Merrick, Stevens was well known as a hunter and used to canoeing on the river, so there's suspicion about the fact that he drowned. And at the same time as this, that William Merrick became the recipient of the transfer of this mill into his hands and not the hands of the Burt family that were related to the Stevens by marriage. Merrick built additional mills, which formed the nucleus of a new small community that grew up by 1816, and it was originally called Merrick's Mills. His wife was Sylvia Comstock, and she was born in 1774, and on the death of her father, her mother remarried a loyalist called Ephraim Ayres, and she became the stepdaughter. Now, during the American Revolution, Ephraim Ayres served in Jessup's Corps and also as a loyalist spy, and for his efforts in support of the British, he was captured and jailed in Albany, New York. It appears during his imprisonment that his wife was allowed to go with her family and some limited property as far as Lunenburg, which is located in present-day Stormont Township. Following the Peace Treaty of 1783, Ephraim was able to leave the prison, and he headed north to Canada to join the rest of his family in Stormont, which was the staging area for any new Empire Loyalists around Cornwall that were waiting for their land claims. There is no record of William Merrick that can be found on any published records of Loyalists in the colony of Massachusetts. So perhaps Merrick, who claimed to be a late Loyalist in arriving here, with no apparent record of service on behalf of the British, had nothing but a basic property claim to look forward to. However, having married Sylvia Comstock, who was the daughter or stepdaughter of a Loyalist, she would have been entitled to Loyalist land. So perhaps the reason that he's recognized in the Loyalist is not for his service, but the fact that his wife was the one that had the Loyalist connections. Some of you may recognize the image of this person who is an infamous American. And hard to believe, but he does have a connection to the Rideau area. This is General Benedict Arnold, who went down in history for betraying his country by taking the plans of West Point that General Washington had and planning to give them to the British. Unfortunately, it was Major John Andre who was the intermediary who was caught with the plans, and he was hanged as a spy by the Americans. And in the meantime, Arnold was able to escape and join the ranks of the British, where he was also appointed to the rank of general. Two sons of General Arnold, Henry Arnold and Richard Arnold, also served as loyalists. Each of them were given a grant of 1,200 acres of land in Wolford Township. Richard Arnold was married in 1804 to Margaret Weatherhead, who was the daughter of another loyalist, Samuel Weatherhead, who had originally settled in Augusta Township. And they had a large family that remained in Upper Canada. Benedict Arnold's own sister, Hannah Arnold, came to live with her nephew Henry in this area, and she died in Montague Township on the Rideau in 1803. Henry and his family were the only ones to remove themselves back to New York City, and he died there in 1826. But today, there's still descendants of Benedict Arnold through his son Richard Arnold that live in the area along the Rideau River. KITLEY Township is located a little bit to the west of this and south of what is now getting onto Smiths Falls. The first settler in KITLEY Township was the Loyalist William Reed. Major William Reed had come to America from his native Ireland as a young man, and he settled in the parish of St. George, Queensboro Township in the state of Georgia. When the war broke out in 1777, William, who was an outspoken young man identified by the rebels as a danger to their cause, sought refuge in eastern Florida, where his father-in-law, David Russell, who was another loyalist, already had fled in exile. There he joined Colonel Brown's Florida Rangers and stayed with them until Georgia was taken over by the British Army, when he returned as a loyalist to help fight there. He served at the siege of Savannah, following which he was discharged from the Florida Rangers. He was then commissioned as a lieutenant in the Georgia militia and granted a captain's commission under Sir James Wright. He remained in the King's service until the evacuation of Savannah and then went to St. Augustine in Florida. During the war, he was later taken prisoner and had clothing and arms valued at 12 pounds taken from him and launched a claim later on. His lands and possessions were entirely confiscated and sold by the Americans. In 1784, he took his family to Canso in Nova Scotia, but he found the land there very inhospitable and didn't stay there too long. So he set off for Quebec and applied for land originally in Hinchinbrook, but he didn't stay there long. In response to Governor Simcoe's proclamation about new lands available in Upper Canada, he moved his family to Leeds County in 1797, first at the front of Young Township, and then finally settled in KITLEY on Lot 27, Concession 8, near present-day Frankville. So he is in this particular, just one moment here, this particular region here. And this would have been connected up here. If you follow through the Irish Lake and Irish Creek, it will take you up to the Rideau, not too far from Smiths Falls. So as early as 1807, William Reed began to gather volunteers to serve as a local militia, anticipating that there might be further outbreaks. And in the War of 1812, he defended himself and became the second man in charge of the 2nd Regiment of the Leeds County Militia, commanded by Colonel Joel Stone, who came from Gananoque. He died in 1828 at the age of 79 years of age and was buried on his farm near the town of Frankville in KITLEY Township of Leeds County. There were several other families that were Loyalist connection and I'll just briefly go over them. One of them was Gideon Adams. He was born in the state of Connecticut in 1755 and served as another officer in Jessup's Corps. He settled the area of South Gore. He became a justice of the peace for the Eastern District of Upper Canada in 1797 and later became a member of the Parliament of Upper Canada. He died there in 1834. Asahel Hurd was a member of the King's Rangers, and he enlisted at the age of 10. Now, believe it or not, you could serve that young, and he served originally as a drummer boy, with the military, and he later served with Stephen Burritt. And because of his connections with the Burritts, decided that he would take up land near Burritt's Rapid. He ended up marrying one of Stephen's daughters, Sally Burritt. And during the War of 1812, he was appointed as a captain in the local militia. He again is buried along with the Burritts in that cemetery at Burritt's Rapids. As was mentioned earlier, Nepean Township was surveyed very early, but Gershom French had decided that this region was not well suited for Loyalist settlement. So what is now present-day downtown Ottawa area was not open too much to the settlement. However, there were some Loyalist families that did get some land grants, and one of them was the Fraser family. Originally, the Frasers had settled on the St. Lawrence River, and their land grants were given to land that was in the present downtown core of Ottawa, but appears that they never actually moved there or set up any buildings on the site. However, they realized the site had a potential, and it was not soon afterwards that they sold the property to a speculator who was one of the founders of this area. You may recognize the name. The man that bought his land was Nicholas Sparks. The image here shows the area what would have been a little bit to the east of where the grants were. This is what is now known as Major's Hill, and what you see is a sketch at the of Colonel Bye's home and headquarters at the time of the construction of the canal. So you can see there was very little going on in what is now Ottawa. The next phase of settlement along the Rideau were the military settlements that took place. After the War of 1812, Lord Bathurst decreed that Canada should become more loyal to the Crown, and in order to do that, he suggested that soldiers receive land grants in critical transportation areas across Upper Canada. Now, these were to go not only to men who had served in Canada on the side of the War of 1812, but also to disbanded soldiers following the Napoleonic Wars. They were given particular lands along the critical waterways, one of which was considered to be the Rideau system. The first settlement of the military groups took place in Perth in 1816, but more relevant to our story tonight was the Richmond settlement, which was to take place here. The Richmond settlement was connected along the Jock River to the Rideau River, and then to the areas that have already been settled, and upstream as well to the Ottawa River. The settlement of Richmond was established in 1818, and it was surveyed by a man by the name of Joseph Fortune, who happened to be the son of another Loyalist, Colonel William Fortune, who came from South Carolina. William Fortune received a huge tract of land on the west side of the Ottawa River at what is now Point Fortune, Quebec, and stretched all the way into East Hawkesbury Township in Upper Canada. As part of the plans to provide an alternate military transportation route by water to bypass the St. Lawrence because of its closeness to the Americans in case of any future wars, the Royal Engineers were sent to Canada after 1815 to explore the Rideau River for any potential for a canal system. And it was several years before the actual work would begin. In 1826, the new British Prime Minister, none other than the Duke of Wellington, was all in favor of this. And he instructed Colonel John Bye to come to Canada to oversee the construction of the Rideau Canal system from Ottawa to Kingston. The idea was that any transportation could go from Kingston up to Ottawa and then down the Ottawa River to Montreal and bypass the St. Lawrence should another war ever break out against the Americans. Construction started with the sod turning on September 29th of 1826 and was completed in 1832. This further opened up the settlements along the Rideau River right from Ottawa down to Kingston to further new settlements, not only by Loyalists, but also to the Irish who helped with the construction and many of the Scots who served as masons working on the canals. The completed waterway consisted of 47 masonry locks, 52 dams, and many of the stonemasons that did the work on this remained behind in Upper Canada and built fine Georgian homes that you may see in many of these communities even today. Even in our own Lanark County, you'll see some of these areas that were settled by some of the stonemasons, and their typical construction is very similar throughout there. Today, the Rideau Canal is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and still a popular tourist destination. Pictured here, many of you may recognize, is present-day Merrickville. And you'll see the blockhouse that was constructed by Colonel By, as well as the canals along the parkway. Just on the right-hand side of that would be the regular river with the mills that we showed the ruins of earlier today. The settlements along the Rideau at the present owe a debt to the early Loyalists who braved the backwoods of this area to create a new life, not only for themselves, but the future of their families and for our present day generations. Many of the descendants of these brave Loyalists are still located in the Rideau River area. So that completes the explanation of some of the settlements that are connected with the Loyalists along this little known area called the Rideau River.
Thank you so much, Brian. Did anybody have any questions they'd like to ask or any comments?
I was wondering what religion all these Loyalists were. Were they Methodists usually?
It varied. The official religion, according to the British government, was Anglican,
Right.
but a lot of them that came over, particularly along the St. Lawrence originally, a lot of these families did have relatives on the St. Lawrence, would have been Methodists. Sort of the roots of Methodism in Canada have two areas, one in Adolphustown with Hay Bay Church, and the other one is the Prescott area with Blue Church, you may be familiar with. Barbara Heck is buried there. So they were not exclusively Anglicans. Some would have been Catholic. I really haven't delved into the religious background of some of these, but I would think it would be a good mixture.
Thanks. It was interesting.
Brian?
Yeah.
When the children inherited the land at the age of 21, how was that decided location-wise? Were they near their parents when they were given this land, or?
By and large, not, because what happened now in the Rideau area, it might have been the case because there was still land available. But if you follow along the lakeshore and the St. Lawrence Valley, by the time you get to the next generation, most of the good land is gone. So you'll find that when the 200 acres are given to the children, both the sons and the daughters, it may not necessarily be in that area. One of my areas of expertise is the Bay of Quinte, and you'll find that what happened is all the area sort of to the east of Belleville filled up. So the next generation had to go into Hastings County, Northumberland County, and further west, even as going as far as the Toronto area. So that doesn't mean they moved there. It means they received land there. Sometimes they would sell the land and turn around and try to buy a farm that would be closer to where their family was.
Right.
So it was pretty generous that they got 200 acres of lands. And it saved the other problem, which happened in the later generations, like if you come up to Lanark County where you have the Scots, they might have gotten 100 acres or 50 acres, but the children didn't get anything. So all of a sudden, by the time you go to the second generation, if you had 5 boys and had to divide your 100-acre farm amongst them, well, the farms are starting to get pretty small.
Mhm.
Does that sort of answer that, Debbie?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
I have a Loyalist ancestor who had several sons,
Okay.
and one is not mentioned as being his son on the Loyalist list. And the only record I can find for his land grant is there's a land board record that says he received the full 200 acres as the son of William Urquhart UE. If you
Okay.
look at the land records, there's no land record for it. But what there is about 1820, William Urquhart parcels out several lots of 200 acres each to his sons. And would he have got the land and paid for the deeds and then sold the land back to his children? Is that possible?
Could have. You'll find with the original, if he was a loyalist in his own right, there might actually not be a grant for him per se. Now, have you looked at
it actually says son of William Urquhart UE.
Okay. He should have been entitled to the 200 acres. It doesn't mean that everybody got it, because if you didn't apply for land, you didn't get land. Yeah. Have you checked the Upper Canada land petition records at all for him?
I haven't checked those, but this is an actual land board item from, I think, 1794, and yet there doesn't, going through the land around that area, there doesn't seem to be anything except this notation that he got 200 acres, and I can't find it.
Yeah, I would, if you go online to the Upper Canada Land Petitions Index and just put his surname in and see if he appears, you can actually find his original grants or his application for land as the son of a loyalist. It's possible he may have received land elsewhere too and felt it was too far to move. That's not uncommon, where you did get a land grant and it was so far away you end up selling it and buying something in your own locality. So maybe that's what happened to him when you say about selling this to his other children.
The Williams land was in Charlottenburg, and this other was in Kenyon, which isn't really that far away.
No. But again, those areas filled up within about a generation. So the later you are to apply for land for children, the less choice was there, basically. Does that help a bit, Jan?
I don't know. I'm going to have to do some more work on him, because he's driving me crazy, because I can prove Alexander's William's son, and I can prove everybody back to Alexander's son James, but I can't link James and Alexander conclusively, and it just is.
Okay.
It's one of those weird things, you know. That generation is the hardest to find. Yeah.
Well, if worst comes to worst, you can always email me and see if I can find something on that area. So
yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Brian.
Yeah.
I was interested in the reference to Gershom French. He was the brother of my ancestor, Sarah Marsh.
Oh, okay.
Another sibling was Jeremiah French UE.
And Jeremiah French is one of the few loyalists that the actual original uniform still exists. It's at the War Museum. Is that correct, Peter? I think
that's right. It's the only surviving uniform from the King's Royal Regiment of New York.
Right.
The Robertson House is in Upper Canada Village, incorporates part of his original house. And his 1769 house in Manchester, Vermont is still standing.
Okay.
So he's well represented.
Yeah. Oh. And he was an officer, was he not, Jeremiah French?
Yes.
Excellent presentation, Brian. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Marcia?
Yes. Do you know much about the clergy reserves and the crown reserves relative to?
I can't remember the proportions, but for every township, there was a certain amount that had to be kept as clergy and school reserves and things like that. But that got overridden in some areas, particularly after Bathurst decreed that we needed to get more loyal subjects in. And sometimes people were granted, I guess it was sort of a lease on those properties before they got the proper ownership. It was like a harder piece of property to get the proper ownership document for. But they did allow leases originally, and then once somebody been on the land for say 20 or 30 years, it was kind of hard to kick them off, so they ended up getting ownership. But it was a long process they had to go through. Sometimes those properties would have been sold off by the actual clergies in order to build a church and get the required
Right.
money.
Right.
That's one of the reasons why they liked leasing it, because it gave them, the churches, some additional income.
Okay. And I was
There are
reading,
books that are written on the clergy reserves and
Yeah.
and some of that as well.
I was reading about, I think it was Beckwith. That's, most of the lots were 200 acres, but the lots along one edge were 100 acres
Okay.
because of the, just the way the numbers worked out, I guess. So I was wondering why that was, or who got stuck with 100 acres.
Standard lots were usually 200, but when it came to settlement by the 1820s, most of the settlers were only getting 100-acre grants because they would do, depending on the orientation, sometimes it'd be north half, south half, but sometimes they'll switch it. Maybe the lot next to it might be an east half and a west half. It depends on where the concession roads were being constructed in many cases too.
Right.
So,
Hey.
yeah.
Yeah, if there are no more questions, thank you again, Brian, so much for taking the time
Thank
to
you.
prepare your presentation. It really is such a pleasure to listen to your talks, and this one was certainly no exception. And to those in our audience, thank you so much for signing on this evening and participating. Your support of the North Lanark Historical Society is greatly appreciated, and we really hope that you enjoyed listening in. So thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your evening.